Good evening, everybody. My name is Keith, and this week I'm going to be using symmetry to graph a polar equation. Our question this week is test for symmetry, then identify the graph of the polar equation. Our polar equation is r equals -6 cosine of theta, and that is going to be a circle to help identify our graph later on. So if you look at section A, we're going to test the polar axis for symmetry first. The way you test the polar axis for the polar axis symmetry is you replace theta in the polar equation with negative theta. If you rewrite that, it is r equals -6 cosine of negative theta. Since cosine is an even function, cosine of negative theta can be rewritten as cosine of theta, which then equals r equals -6 cosine of theta. Since the equations equal each other, yes, it is symmetrical with the polar axis. If you look at section B, we're going to be testing the line of theta equals pi over 2, or the y-axis, to see if our equation is symmetrical with the y-axis. The way you do that is you replace r and theta with negative r and negative theta. So if you rewrite the equation, negative r equals -6 cosine negative theta. Cosine is still the even function, so we'll rewrite the cosine of negative theta back as cosine of theta. And to get the r positive, we multiply both sides by -1. And the equation becomes r equals +6 cosine of theta. Since the equation changed, we now can determine that it may or may not be symmetrical to the y-axis. If you go on to section C, we're going to test the pole for symmetry. The way you do that is you replace r with negative r in the polar equation. So that looks like negative r equals -6 cosine of theta. To get rid of the negative r, we'll multiply both sides by -1 and get r equals 6 cosine of theta. Since the polar equation changed, it may or may not be symmetrical. So we do know that the polar axis is symmetrical, and we don't know if the y or the pole is symmetrical. The way to identify this graph, if you look, I have it graphed here. The graph of r -6 cosine theta. Since a, which is the diameter, is negative, and that's less than 0 at the origin, the circle is going to be opening out to the left. And since it's the cosine function, it's going to be bisected by the x-axis, or the polar axis. So what you would do is you would draw a circle intersecting the diameter of the circle, which would be at -6, and the radius would be -3. So that's how you would identify what type of, or that's how you get a basic idea of the symmetry and what the graph would look like. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. Have a good night.